The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days ago. Sarah Mackenzie pressed her back against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree, her 6-month-old son Thomas whimpering softly in her arms. The New Mexico territory stretched endlessly before them, red rock formations jutting from the earth like ancient monuments, sparse vegetation clinging to life in the unforgiving landscape. The sun was merciless, beating down on the dusty ground where her husband's bootprints had disappeared into the vast wilderness. "He's not coming back," she whispered to Thomas, her voice cracking like the parched earth beneath them. The baby's blue eyes, so much like his father's, looked up at her with innocent trust that made her heart shatter all over again. 3 days earlier, James had kissed her forehead and promised to return with help. Their wagon had broken an axle 20 miles from the nearest settlement, and their water was running dangerously low. "Stay here with the baby," he'd said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'll bring back men and supplies. 2 days, maybe 3 at most." But Sarah had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made her stomach turn. It was the same look he'd worn when he'd lost their life savings in a poker game in Santa Fe. The same look when he'd suggested they start fresh in California, leaving behind the debts and disappointed faces of their families back in Missouri. Now, as the third sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the terrible truth settled over her like a funeral shroud. James hadn't gone for help. He'd simply left her and their son to die in the wilderness while he disappeared into whatever new life awaited him somewhere else. The baby's crying grew more insistent, and Sarah realized with growing panic that she had no milk left to give him. Her body, deprived of food and water, had stopped producing what little sustenance she could offer. She'd given Thomas the last drops of their water that morning, watching his tiny lips work desperately at the empty bottle. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, clutching him closer. "I'm so sorry, my sweet boy." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that made her freeze. Smoke, wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the horizon. Where there was smoke, there were people. But out here in Apache territory, that could mean salvation or something far worse. She'd heard the stories whispered around campfires and in general stores. Tales of settlers found scalped and mutilated, of women and children taken as captives, of whole families disappearing without a trace. The Apache were legendary fighters, skilled in warfare and survival in this harsh land that had claimed so many white settlers. But as Thomas's cries grew weaker and more desperate, Sarah realized she had no choice. Death was coming for them either way. At least if she moved toward the smoke, there was a chance, however small, that mercy might find them instead. She struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from hunger and exhaustion. The simple act of standing sent waves of dizziness through her, and she had to grip the tree trunk to keep from falling. Her water-stained dress hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight rapidly over the past few days. "Come on, Thomas," she whispered, adjusting her grip on the baby. "We're going to walk toward that smoke, and we're going to pray that whoever made that fire has more compassion than your father did." The sun was setting as she began her desperate journey across the rough terrain, each step a monumental effort. Behind her, the abandoned wagon sat like a monument to broken promises and shattered dreams. Ahead lay the unknown. But even the unknown was better than the certain death that awaited them if they stayed put. As darkness began to fall over the New Mexico wilderness, Sarah Mackenzie walked toward the distant smoke, carrying her son and the last flickering ember of hope in her heart. The smoke was closer now, maybe half a mile away, but Sarah's legs felt like they were made of lead. She'd been walking for over an hour, stumbling over rocks and thorny brush, her bare feet bloody and torn. Her shoes had been lost somewhere in the darkness, though she couldn't remember when or how. Thomas had stopped crying. The silence was worse than his wails. It meant he was conserving the last of his strength. She could feel how light he'd become in her arms, how his tiny body seemed to be fading away even as she held him. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just a little further." The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape and making the rock formations look like sleeping giants. In the distance, she could see the orange glow of a campfire nestled in a small canyon between two mesa walls. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and terror. She was perhaps 50 yards from the fire when she heard it, the soft nicker of a horse. Then another. Her blood turned to ice as she realized there were multiple horses, which meant multiple riders. A war party, perhaps, or traders, or... She couldn't let herself think of the worst possibilities. Sarah pressed herself against a large boulder, trying to calm her ragged breathing. She needed to see who was down there before she committed to approaching. Slowly, carefully, she crept closer, using the rocks and sparse vegetation as cover. The fire was larger than she'd expected, built in a ring of stones with several figures sitting around it. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw them clearly. 3 Apache warriors, their long black hair gleaming in the firelight, their faces painted with ceremonial marks she didn't recognize. One of them was tending to what looked like a wounded animal, a young coyote with its leg bound in strips of hide. Another was working on what appeared to be arrows, carefully checking each point and fletching. The third sat perfectly still, staring into the flames with an expression of deep contemplation. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. These weren't the savage raiders from the campfire stories. There was something almost peaceful about the scene. The way the one man gently cradled the injured coyote, the careful precision of the arrow maker, the quiet dignity of the third figure. But just as she was beginning to think she might be able to approach them, Thomas chose that moment to let out a weak, desperate cry. The effect was instantaneous. All 3 warriors were on their feet in seconds, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness with predatory intensity. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking. "Please, I have a baby. We're dying." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then slowly, the tallest of the 3 warriors stepped forward. He was lean and muscular, with intelligent dark eyes and a face that spoke of both strength and suffering. His hair was braided with small feathers and beads, and he wore buckskin clothing that looked both practical and ceremonial. "Come forward," he said in English, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. Slowly. Sarah's legs nearly gave out with relief. She stumbled forward, clutching Thomas to her chest, and collapsed at the edge of the firelight. The warrior knelt beside her, his movements careful and non-threatening. "You are hurt," he observed, noting the cuts on her feet and the way she swayed with exhaustion. "My baby," Sarah gasped. He needs milk, food, water. I can't feed him anymore." The warrior's eyes shifted to Thomas, and Sarah saw something change in his expression. The other 2 men had moved closer, and she caught fragments of their conversation in what she assumed was Apache. Their tone was serious, but not hostile. "I am a Yana," the tall warrior said, returning his attention to Sarah. "These are my brothers, Naalnish and Bidzil. You are far from any settlement. How did you come to be here?" Sarah's story came out in broken fragments: the wagon, the broken axle, James's promise to return, the 3 days of waiting, the terrible realization that he wasn't coming back. As she spoke, she watched Ayana's face, trying to read his reaction. "Your husband left you to die," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah whispered, shame and grief overwhelming her. Ayana was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to one of his companions and spoke rapidly in Apache. The man, Nalnish, nodded and began rummaging through their supplies. "We have water," Ayana said, turning back to Sarah, "and food. But your child needs milk and we have none." Sarah's heart sank. She'd known it was a long shot, but hearing it confirmed felt like a death sentence. "However," Ayana continued, "there is a settlement 2 days' ride south. They have cattle there and women who might help, but first you must rest and regain your strength." He gestured to a spot near the fire, and Sarah gratefully sank down onto the warm sand. Nalnish brought her a water skin and a strip of dried meat, while Bidzil tended to the fire, making it larger and warmer. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked as she sipped the water, feeling life slowly returning to her body. Ayana settled across from her, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Because," he said simply, "a child should not suffer for the failures of his father, and because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because I know what it is to be abandoned by those who should protect you." There was pain in his voice, old and deep, and Sarah found herself looking at him with new eyes. This wasn't the savage warrior of frontier legends. This was a man who had known loss and betrayal, who understood suffering and chose compassion in spite of it. As Thomas settled into a fitful sleep in her arms, warmed by the fire and comforted by the presence of water and food, Sarah realized that her story wasn't ending in this wilderness after all. It was beginning. Dawn came slowly to the New Mexico desert, painting the sky in soft pastels before the sun climbed high enough to burn away the cool morning air. Sarah woke to the sound of horses moving and men speaking in low voices. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then she felt Thomas's small weight in her arms, and the memories of the previous night came flooding back. Ayana was crouched beside the fire, brewing what smelled like pine needle tea in a small metal pot. He'd removed his ceremonial paint, and in the morning light, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought. Perhaps in his early 30s, with strong features and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. "You slept well," he observed, handing her a cup of the tea. "The child too." Sarah accepted the warm cup gratefully, inhaling the aromatic steam. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay you." "Repayment is not necessary," Ayana replied. "But we must leave soon if we're to reach the settlement by nightfall tomorrow. Can you ride?" Sarah looked over at the horses, beautiful animals with painted markings and simple bridles. I can try, but Thomas—" "Will ride with you," Ayana said firmly. "Nalnish has fashioned a carrier that will keep him secure against your body, and I will ride beside you to ensure you don't fall." The next hour was spent breaking camp and preparing for the journey. Sarah watched in fascination as the three warriors worked with practiced efficiency, packing their supplies and checking their weapons. Everything had its place. Every movement had purpose. Nalnish approached her with what looked like a complex arrangement of soft hide and cordage. "For the baby," he said in heavily accented English, demonstrating how the carrier would wrap around her torso and create a secure pouch for Thomas. "This is beautiful work," Sarah said, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork that decorated the edges. "Did you make this?" Nalnish nodded, a small smile creasing his weathered face. "My wife. She taught me, before the soldiers came." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her heart clench. These men had lost so much: family, homeland, their entire way of life. Yet they were risking their own safety to help her and her son. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Nalnish's smile widened slightly. The past is like smoke. It rises and disappears, but the fire continues to burn. We tend the fire. Once Thomas was secured in the carrier, Ayana helped Sarah mount a gentle mare named Ciala. The horse was patient and steady, seeming to understand that her rider was inexperienced and fragile. Ayana mounted his own horse, a magnificent stallion with intelligent eyes and a proud bearing. "His name is Hoshi," Ayana said, noticing her admiration. "It means star in our language. He has carried me through many difficult journeys." As they began to ride, Sarah found herself marveling at the landscape that had seemed so hostile just hours before. Under Ayana's guidance, she began to see the desert differently, not as a barren wasteland, but as a complex ecosystem full of life and beauty. He pointed out edible plants, showed her how to read the signs of water and weather, taught her to identify the calls of different birds. "The land is not empty," he explained, as they paused to rest the horses beside a small spring. "It is full of voices if you know how to listen." "You speak English very well," Sarah observed. "Where did you learn?" Ayana was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas sleep peacefully in his carrier. "There was a mission school when I was young, before the troubles began. A priest named Father Miguel taught me to read and write. He was a good man, different from the others." "What happened to him?" "He died trying to protect our children during a raid. The soldiers, they didn't distinguish between those who helped them and those who fought them." Ayana's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the underlying grief. "That was when I learned that survival means understanding both worlds, the one we came from and the one we must live in now." As they continued their journey, Sarah found herself drawn into conversation with this complex man who seemed to carry the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. He told her about his people's history, their connection to the land, their struggle to maintain their identity in the face of overwhelming change. "My son," she said suddenly, looking down at Thomas, "he'll grow up in a world where your people and mine are enemies. How do I teach him that it doesn't have to be that way?" Ayana was quiet for a long time, considering her words. "You teach him what you are learning now," he said finally. "That beneath the surface, we are all the same. We all love our children, we all fear loss, we all hope for a better tomorrow." The sun was beginning to set when they made camp for the night in a sheltered canyon. As Bidzil prepared their evening meal and Nalnish tended to the horses, Ayana sat beside Sarah, watching her feed Thomas small drops of water from her finger. "He is getting weaker," Ayana observed quietly. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "I know. I can feel it. If we don't reach the settlement tomorrow—" "We will," Ayana said firmly, "and there will be women there who have nursed children. Your son will live." "How can you be so certain?" Ayana looked up at the emerging stars, his expression thoughtful. "Because some things are meant to be. Your husband abandoned you, but you survived long enough to find us. Your child is weak, but he fights to live. These are not accidents. You believe in fate. I believe in the great circle of life. What appears to be an ending is often a beginning. What seems like death can be rebirth." He turned to look at her directly. "Your old life is over, Sarah, but your new life is just beginning." As they settled in for the night, Sarah found herself thinking about his words. Everything she'd known, her marriage, her plans for the future, her very identity, had been stripped away. But lying here under the vast desert sky, with her son sleeping peacefully in her arms, and a man who had shown her more kindness than her own husband watching over them, she began to understand what Ayana meant. She wasn't just surviving, she was being reborn. The settlement of Mesilla appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its adobe buildings shimmering in the afternoon heat. Sarah's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and apprehension as they approached the small community that straddled the Rio Grande. Thomas had grown increasingly listless during the morning ride, and she knew they had reached the settlement just in time. There, Ayana pointed to a modest house with smoke rising from its chimney. That is where we will find help. As they rode into the settlement, Sarah noticed the stares and whispers their unusual group attracted. A white woman traveling with Apache warriors was clearly not a common sight, and she could see fear and suspicion in the faces of the settlers who watched them pass. They stopped in front of the house Ayana had indicated, and he dismounted with fluid grace. Elena Vasquez lives here, he explained, helping Sarah down from her horse. She is a midwife and healer. She has helped my people before, in times of need. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a middle-aged Mexican woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked from Sarah to the baby in her arms, then to Ayana, and understanding dawned on her face. "Ayana," she said warmly, switching to Spanish before catching herself and speaking in English. "What have you brought me?" "A mother and child who need help," Ayana replied. "They have been in the desert for 3 days without food or water. The baby." Elena stepped forward, her experienced eyes taking in Thomas's weakened condition. "Bring them inside, quickly." The interior of the house was cool and welcoming, with whitewashed walls and simple but comfortable furniture. Elena immediately began preparing what looked like a weak broth while directing Sarah to a chair near the window. "I am Elena," she said, her English accented but clear. "I help bring babies into this world and sometimes help keep them here." "May I examine your son?" Sarah nodded, carefully unwrapping Thomas from his carrier. Elena's gentle hands moved over the baby's small body, checking his breathing, his pulse, the condition of his skin. "He is dehydrated and malnourished, but he is strong," Elena pronounced after her examination. "I have a goat that has just given birth. Her milk will be easier for him to digest than cow's milk." Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that she began to cry. Elena wrapped her in a warm embrace, murmuring soothing words in Spanish while Ayana watched from the doorway. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you so much." "We help each other," Elena said simply. "This is how we survive in this hard land." Over the next several hours, Elena worked tirelessly to restore both mother and child. She fed Thomas goat's milk drop by drop, monitoring his response carefully. She prepared nutritious broths for Sarah and tended to the cuts and scratches that covered her feet and hands. As evening approached, Thomas began to show signs of improvement. His color was better, his breathing stronger, and he had even managed to take several ounces of milk without difficulty. "He will live," Elena announced with satisfaction. "But he needs time to fully recover his strength. You should stay here for several days at least." "I don't have any money," Sarah said quietly. "My husband, he left us with nothing." Elena waved her hand dismissively. "Who speaks of money? You have a child who needs care. That is payment enough." Ayana, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. "I must leave tomorrow," he said. "My brothers and I have business to attend to, but I will return in a few days to check on you." Sarah felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving. This man had saved their lives, had shown them kindness when they had no right to expect it. The thought of being without his protection, his quiet strength, was frightening. "Will you really come back?" she asked. Ayana's dark eyes met hers. "I give you my word." That night, as Sarah lay in Elena's spare bed with Thomas sleeping peacefully beside her, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this place. 3 days ago, she had been a married woman with a settled life and clear expectations for the future. Now she was a widow, for surely that's what she was, even if James still lived somewhere, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby to care for. But she wasn't alone. Elena had insisted they stay as long as needed, and Sarah had already begun to see how she might be useful around the house and in the woman's midwifery practice. She had assisted with births back in Missouri and had some knowledge of herbs and healing. More importantly, she had found something she hadn't expected, a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from her life even before James's betrayal. Here, in this small desert community, with a Mexican healer and an Apache warrior as her guides, she was beginning to discover who she really was. A week later, Ayanna returned as promised. Sarah was in Elena's garden, hanging laundry to dry in the desert sun, while Thomas slept in a basket beside her. She heard horses approaching and looked up to see Ayanna riding alone, his stallion Hoshi prancing with barely contained energy. "You look well," he observed, dismounting and approaching her with that careful grace she had come to associate with him. "Thanks to you," Sarah replied, then paused in her work to really look at him. "You came back." "I said I would." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she caught something warmer in his eyes. "How is the child?" "See for yourself," she said, gesturing to the basket where Thomas was sleeping peacefully, his cheeks now pink with health. Ayanna knelt beside the basket, his expression softening as he watched the baby sleep. "He is strong like his mother." "I'm not strong," Sarah protested. "I was ready to give up and die in the desert." "But you didn't," Ayanna pointed out. "You fought for your child. You walked toward the unknown rather than accepting defeat. That is strength." They talked for hours that afternoon, sitting in Elena's garden while Thomas played contentedly between them. Sarah learned more about Ayanna's life, how he'd lost his wife and daughter to disease, how he'd chosen to live between worlds rather than retreat entirely into the old ways, how he struggled to find meaning in a life that had been shaped by loss. "I thought I was finished," he admitted as the sun began to set, "that my story was over and all that remained was to live out my days in solitude." "And now?" Sarah asked softly. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas try to grab a butterfly that had landed near his blanket. "Now I think perhaps there are different kinds of stories. Some end, others begin again." "What are you saying?" He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "I am saying that if you are willing, I would like to be part of your new story, and perhaps you could be part of mine." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Ayanna." "I know what you're thinking," he said gently. "I know what people will say. A white woman and an Apache warrior, but Elena has told me about your situation. You have no husband, no family to return to, and I find myself caring about what happens to you and the child." "It would be difficult," Sarah said quietly. "Dangerous even." "Yes," Ayanna agreed, "but not impossible. There are places where we could live peacefully, communities where mixed families are accepted. And I have skills, hunting, tracking, trading. I could provide for you and the child." Sarah looked down at Thomas, who was now reaching for her with chubby hands. In his innocent face, she saw endless possibilities, a future that wasn't defined by the limitations others might place on them, but by the love and courage they could build together. "What would you call this new story?" she asked. Ayanna smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw joy in his eyes. "I would call it a story of second chances, of finding family in unexpected places, of learning that love doesn't recognize the boundaries we think divide us." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reached out and took his hand. It was warm and strong, calloused from years of hard living, but gentle in its touch. "Then yes," she said quietly, "I'd like to be part of your story too." 6 months later, Sarah watches with joy as Ayana helps their son, Thomas, take his first steps in their small cabin, a symbol of the life they built together. After a simple wedding and overcoming prejudice, their bond has grown into a true family, founded on love, respect, and resilience. What began in struggle and survival has blossomed into hope and healing, proving that some families are chosen, not born, and that new beginnings often rise from the ashes of the past. Their story, filled with promise, is only just beginning.